Good evening and welcome to Beaches Watch August meeting. I'm Maria Mark. I'm president of Beaches Watch and will be your host for this evening's meeting. We want to welcome you and we have a few announcements to make prior to our program beginning. But we want to also let you know about this particular program that we are hoping to not simply talk at you, but to talk with you. So please place any questions you'd like to ask of our guests in the chat box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program. I will be collecting them throughout the discussion, and we will have time set aside at the end of the program for Q&A from the panelists. So welcome again. As always, our meetings are videoed, so you can see them tomorrow at our YouTube channel, Beaches Watch 2012. Our Beaches Watch membership is always in full swing, so please renew or join for 2021. It's $15 for individual, $20 for family, and $5 for students. Your membership is valid January through December, and you can renew your membership or make a donation online at ourbeacheswatch.com. At this time, I'd like to recognize many of our elected officials and other dignitaries. And right now, it looks like we have Mayor Ellen Glasser from Atlantic Beach. Welcome, Mayor. Happy to have you here. We also have Sandy Golding, who is on our Jacksonville Beach City Council. And I'm just trying to see if there's anyone else who signed in. I don't see anyone else at this time. Sometimes I'll sign in a little bit later, but we do welcome Mayor Glasser and City Council person Sandy Golding to the meeting. So a couple of announcements that's coming up as far as some meetings. In Neptune Beach, we'll be holding a joint meeting with Council and Community Development Board on August 18th at 6 p.m. This will be to kick off phase 3 of the Neptune Beach Community Vision Plan. And they will also be updating the land development code. Atlantic Beach budget workshops are scheduled for Thursday, August 19 at 6 p.m. in the City Commission chamber. They will be hosting the budget hearings on Monday, September 13th. That will be the first hearing to adopt the budget and millage rate. And then Monday, September 27th will be the second hearing to adopt the budget and the millage rate. We also have, let's see, Jacksonville Beach is also has their budget workshops. They have a number of workshops scheduled. So these dates will be listed on our website. We'll not mention them here because there are quite a number of them. Their budget hearings, though, are scheduled for September the 8th at 5:15. That's the first hearing. And then Monday, September 13th, that will be the second hearing to adopt the budget and millage rate. Also, Jacksonville Beach is undergoing their charter review. They are holding monthly meetings. The first meeting or the next meeting is scheduled for Monday, August 23rd at 5:30. These are all virtual meetings. The second meeting will be held Thursday, August 26th at 5:30 p.m. Something to be mindful of, the 35-foot height limitation will be discussed during these charter review meetings. So contact your city council person to find out when that particular subject is going to be a topic or one of the topics. There's some discussion about possibly raising that height limit in the commercial business district of Jacksonville Beach. So we just want to make sure all the citizens are aware of those conversations. Our next community meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, September 1 at 7 p.m. The topic will be the Mayport Naval Station updates, and we will have the Mayport Commanding Officer, Captain Jason G. Canfield, leading that discussion. We had hoped to have resumed our face-to-face meetings in September, but unfortunately, with the surge of COVID, we decided to postpone the face-to-face meetings until further notice. So this meeting will also be held via Zoom. I think that's all for discussion, all for the announcements. So our program tonight is a thoughtful conversation about gun issues. We really want to have a conversation about gun policy in our laws and in our lives. Our guests are Dr. Robert Spitzer, a nationally known expert on the history and development of policies about gun ownership and use. Ms. Jean Francis represents the national organization Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense. And Mr. Dale Carson is a well-known local expert with background on our police force as an FBI trainer and presently as a defense attorney. We did extend an invitation to Representative Cord Byrd to serve as a panelist. We did not hear anything back from his office. So let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. And without promoting or decrying either gun proponents or protesters, we hope to become better informed about how guns came to have a role that they do and some of the effects of their widespread availability. Our host for this conversation is our programs committee member, Sharon Scholl, who was instrumental in putting this whole program together, as well as contacting the panelists. So we want to thank Sharon for all her hard work in putting this program together, and we look forward to a very meaningful discussion. Again, please put any questions or any comments in the chat box. We will be monitoring that, and we will have the Q&A following the panelist discussion. Sharon, I hand this over to you. Thank you.
All righty. Good evening, all. The purpose of our program is to shed some wisdom on a topic that we're all frankly tired of, but one that scares us and divides us as we deal with the presence of so many guns in our communities. Questions will be passed among our guests, who will respond briefly, concentrating on the core of each concern, and we can then move to include additional topics and your questions at the end of our program. So please send them to us. Our first topic concerns gun policy, its origins and applications, and we're going to go way back. Dr. Spitzer, would you start us at the beginning? Why did gun possession become a provision in one of our founding documents?
Well, good evening. I trust you can hear me.
Right.
Very good. Thank you. And hello to everybody who's tuning in. Let me say two things. We know that gun ownership is as old as America. From the very earliest European settlers who came to what became America in the early 1600s, they brought guns with them. They used guns. Guns were always here. That's well known. But what is not so well known is that gun control is as old as America. That is to say, gun laws are as old as America. The typical impression one has is that gun regulations, gun laws are an artifact of the modern era, beginning in the 20th century. And certainly there were modern federal gun laws enacted beginning in the 1930s and then on since then. But what is not so well known is that gun laws are as old as America, and that from the 1600s up until covering the 1700s, 1800s, and of course into the 20th century, the colonies, the states, and communities enacted literally thousands of gun laws of every imaginable variety. There is no gun law that anybody could conceive of that did not exist somewhere, someplace in America hundreds of years ago. And the political side of this story is that there was no particularly sharp conflict between the existence of gun laws and what one might identify as gun rights. They existed really pretty well together in our first 300 years. It's really only been in the last few decades where this politicization of the gun issue has resulted in a kind of configuration such that one side views a gain for
looks like we may have some technical problems here. Dr. Spitzer, I don't know if you can hear me, but it seems that you're frozen, your transmission froze.
Maybe he can sign back in and we can redirect to one of the other two.
Right, right. Let's go on to Ms. Francis for the moment. Your organization, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense, has a legislative priority to make some change in the present policy. So would you describe the change that your organization advocates, and how did you come to focus on that one, and why do you think this particular effort might have some success?
You need to unmute, Ms. Francis. You're still muted. Sorry.
No, okay, now I got it. We have 3 legislative priorities at the federal level and several at the state level. The first one is the permanent appointment of an ATF director. We hear often that we don't need any more laws, we should just enforce the laws we have. But the ATF has been gutted and has been without stable leadership for some time. So we believe that getting a permanent director is a critical issue for having that type of stability. The second area is in the regulation of ghost guns. Ghost guns, for those of you who don't know, are really kits that can be bought online without any regulation, and people can build their own, any type of weapon, essentially. They are unregistered, they are cannot be tracked, they are becoming the darling of the criminal element. But also I worry about our young people, our teenagers who are enthused about engineering and building things. Well, they could build a gun and then they have that weapon at their disposal. And we've already seen some of those school shootings, ghost guns have been used there. And then the final area for the federal level is background checks for all gun sales. David Chipman, who is Biden's nominee for the director of ATF, has said that background checks would be the most efficient and quickest way to end gun trafficking. And in those states that have enacted a broader background check, they have seen a decrease in homicides, a decrease in suicides, a decrease in police being shot, and a decrease in trafficking, gun trafficking. So those are our federal priorities.
And those would sort of devolve to the states too.
Well, many of the states have already enacted some of these, particularly with the background checks, and we are beginning to see ghost gun regulations at the state level as well. So it's really, the states have been driving some of these issues. Our problem,
without a director, you can sort of understand.
right? But I mean, again, with gun trafficking, we hear a lot about the problem in, say, Chicago, who actually has some very strong gun laws, but the guns are being trafficked in from the surrounding states who have very weak regulations.
Right.
So having a national policy would be much more helpful.
Well, let's get some opinions here while we're getting set up with Dr. Spitzer again. With Mr. Carson, that you have so many years of law enforcement experience applying our present policies to the training and deployment of our police forces. If you could change any aspect of our present policy that would benefit our law enforcement agencies, what would you choose?
Dale, could you unmute, please?
There we go. Let me first say that it's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I think this is a great way to have citizens involved in setting out the answers to these really difficult questions, at least for a lot of people. Guns are dangerous. There's just no question of that. And typically, in my world, they're used both defensively and offensively when I was working for the government, which has been now many years ago. But one of the things that I perceive that's happened that has caused some real consternation within law enforcement happened about the time of the AIDS epidemic. And before the AIDS epidemic, police officers typically were very hands-on. And we constantly were involved in, can you hear me? Am I still there?
We can hear you, but we can't, we've lost video. There you are.
There we go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you.
So with the AIDS epidemic, there was a real concern about actually touching people, particularly those who were being arrested in a fairly violent encounter. Because previously in the 70s and the 80s, leading up to the 90s, policing was largely hands-on. We were involved in grappling with people. We used nightsticks. We used long flashlights and those kinds of things. And then suddenly with the AIDS epidemic and the desire not to touch people, we moved in this way that has caused the use of not only tasers, but also firearms in order to control individuals. And that is the real problem here. So we see officers using strategies and techniques now that no longer involve physical contact. And that really has caused a great deal of difficulty for the defendants that I represent, who are managed now not only by verbal commands and certainly handguns or the threat of a taser, as opposed to simply having a large police officer tell somebody to stop misbehaving. And we all have in our lives people that are so dangerous looking, shall I say, that we're going to be compliant. And the difficulty today is when we have brought into our environment a number of people who are not typically big, burly police officers, it's difficult to control people. So now we don't want to touch them, and we want to employ these technologies like the taser and handguns themselves in order to control civilians. And that really is part of the serious problem that law enforcement is generally experiencing today.
That is really enlightening. I mean, that's kind of a response that you never read about. It's just amazing. Thank you so much. I want to return to Dr. Spitzer now and pick up how did we get here, and what have been or has been at least one of the big changes in gun policy that has led us to what Mr. Carson is talking about.
Dr. Spitzer, you need to unmute, please.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So sorry. Some computer glitch, I suppose. Two things. Let me just kind of finish up on the point I was making about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was added to the Constitution to make sure that states could form, maintain, and have control over their own state militias at a time when the new, very powerful federal government was given pretty much full control over militias, a control that had been formerly given entirely to the states under the old Articles of Confederation. All of the debate and discussion and all of the direct evidence pertaining to the meaning of the Second Amendment pertained to government organized and regulated militias and citizen participation in those militias. There is no direct evidence that pertains to individual, personal, private uses of guns relevant to the Second Amendment. Now, obviously, people use guns for all sorts of personal reasons, including personal self-defense. But you didn't need the Second Amendment to protect a personal right to self-defense. That was well established in the common law going back hundreds of years. And the militia-based understanding of the amendment was how it was understood, treated in statutory law and in court cases through the 19th century and into the 20th century until the year 2008 and the Supreme Court's decision when it decided that it was should be an individual or personal protection. As to modern gun policy, we have this very odd kind of situation where in the last few decades, we have witnessed the loosening of gun laws, primarily at the state level. That is to say, to use an example, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and to the beginning of the 20th century, for example, every state in the country, except for 3 states, had laws in place that barred or severely restricted civilian concealed carry of guns. That was the standard. And that was the norm in every state but 3 at the start of the 20th century. Those laws remained in place until the early 1980s when we began to see a political shift, a change in state legislatures going in the opposite direction, where state legislatures began to loosen their concealed carry laws. And in fact, in 1981, there was only 1 state, that state was Vermont, that had no restrictions regarding concealed carry. That is to say, if a civilian could legally own a handgun, why that civilian could legally carry it around with him or her without applying for a permit to do that. Only 1 state in 1981. Today, there are 21 states that have dispensed with permitting of civilians carrying concealed weapons. And that's a pretty clear benchmark of how the law has been changed, how the laws have changed in many states to loosen up these laws, even though the standard in our history was really the opposite, despite the imagery that people have of, gun-toting cowboys having shoot-'em-ups throughout the West. And in fact, it was the West and the South, which had the highest rates of violence, that had the strictest gun laws. I'm not sure that fully gets to your question, Sharon, but I don't want to I don't want to extemporize too long.
That really is such a good introduction to the patchwork that we have that was not always so. And this leads into another important concern about sort of our guns versus your guns that we're into. And I want to start with Mr. Carson. We see arising around us a growing industry in defensive deployment of armed guards for schools, businesses, even homes and churches. And these people range from untrained volunteers to off-duty police, to homeowners with loaded pistols right to their bedside. What effect does this phenomenon have on our law enforcement activities?
Well, of course, now when police officers enter a house or serve a search warrant or an arrest warrant, they are constantly cognizant of the fact that the homeowner is likely armed. And that what that means is it means a serious danger for law enforcement. But the core area, I think, goes back further than that, candidly. I think that our fathers came from World War II. They were used to guns. They grew up in farms. We've urbanized. We've come to a condensed area where there are many people all together. And what I find is that people can hardly get away from one another. And there's no area where they can just be by themselves. They're constantly confronting people that they would consider their enemies. And this gets back to a common feature. I wrote a book about this called Arrest Proof Yourself several years ago. And it's about manners. It's about teaching children manners. It's about teaching children to respect others. And when we lack those kind of social kindnesses, we evolve into an area where, like in the West, and we grew up with cowboy movies. We grew up with those. And if somebody insulted you, you took out a gun and you shot them. That's not so unlike what's happening in Jacksonville inner city today. If you offend somebody, the way to resolve the problem is not fisticuffs any longer. It is pulling your gun out, the great equalizer, and solving the problem permanently. So it's a huge problem, and young men get social status when they have guns that they otherwise would not have in their own environments. So that becomes a critical piece of accoutrement, if you will, for these youngsters. And it's extremely dangerous. You mentioned another point, which is that homeowners are keeping their guns next to their beds because they're scared. You know, the media has a lot to do with this. I mean, you can't help but turn on the TV and learn about yet another shooting and another shooting. And if it's not here in Jacksonville, it's all over the country. So it gets focused on you, and we feel like it's just everywhere. So you need to be protected. And the problem with having a gun loose in a home is that it's dangerous to everybody, including the handgun or long gun owner. So people need to understand and grow up with guns. If they're gonna use them, they are very dangerous. They have no conscience. They go off and they hurt people. We know all of this, but there is a faction of society that believes those weapons should be available to defeat an oppressive government. And that's the reason they want to have the guns. And I don't think you'll ever convince them, in my view, that they don't need their guns, because they feel that the government in many respects is oppressive and they want to prepare for the apocalypse. And we see a lot of that now on camera, right? We see these people who are hoarders. They have food, they have weapons, they have property, they have built-in defenses, all of those kinds of things. We see that on TV, and that encourages people to behave in that way.
Well, this leads very sadly to a question I wanted to ask Dr. Spitzer as to how does the rise of this informal army bent upon gun defense impact our political process, the pressure on our gun policies, or any vital function of our governing system?
Well, that's a very important question, because we've seen quite an upsurge in the last few years of gun carrying in public and at public demonstrations. And it has an escalating effect. There is theory in international relations that talks about escalating arms races. And what we are seeing within the United States in a certain respect is an escalating domestic arms race. And here again, if we look at our own past, it provides an important caution, because it was earlier in our history, we had ubiquitous laws that, as I mentioned, restricted or barred the concealed carry of firearms, that sometimes barred the open carrying of firearms, precisely because it was well understood that to engage in those activities was inherently intimidating. And that's why we had laws against a gun display, against threats with guns, which of course are in the criminal, those kinds of laws are in the criminal law today as well. But there is this sort of notion that somehow among some Americans, that anytime a human hand comes into contact with a firearm, then that becomes a protected Second Amendment right. And that's sheer nonsense. It is not only against what our founders believed, it is against the history of law in America, and it represents a grotesque distortion of how people romanticize or think about our past. And the critical political point, and based on the point that Mr. Carson was just making so importantly, is that our political system was founded on peaceful change. It is true that our country was founded in revolution, all right, against the British. But what people fail to mention often is that it was a revolution against the British, but on behalf of our own government, that was designed to be built and function in a representative and peaceful way. Now, obviously, there are people who get better representation than others. There are groups that were excluded throughout our history, but the system has changed to include more people and make it more democratic. And what the founders wanted above all was a political system that could function peacefully, where people expressed themselves through the ballot box, the jury box, through lobbying peacefully, the redress of grievances, and other rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere. They would have abhorred the idea or the very notion of attempting to effect political change through violent means or the threat of violence, and gun carrying in public represents a threat. And it's a threat that is against the very idea of what America stands for.
That's certainly an eloquent statement on that particular proposition. Let me turn to Ms. Francis. Your organization is active in educational outreach to teach effective gun storage and the safe handling of guns when in use. Are we at the stage where gun safety needs to be taught in schools, much like driver education? And how does your training complement or differ from that offered by the National Rifle Association?
Well, you bring up a good point that the NRA used to be the gun safety organization, and they certainly have moved away from that mission. We actually have been able to distribute our Be Smart program through the Duval County school system this year. They distributed the program to all of the parents. In a critical point, speaking of guns being at the bedside, 4 million children live in households with a loaded gun that is unsecure. And we have seen in our own city, children finding those guns, shooting themselves, their parents, a sibling, or a friend. And the saddest part about these, it's very preventable. We believe no matter what the age of the child, it is the adult responsibility to secure the weapons. We've seen study after study, and I've talked to neighbors and friends. Oh yes, my father taught me how to handle a gun. We've taught to respect the gun, but children have an innate curiosity. They know where the guns are, and they will go after them. They will find them. The other big area is in suicide. 2/3 of handgun deaths are suicides. And we are seeing a rising number of teen suicides. 17% of our teens have considered suicide. And again, having a weapon in the house increases the likelihood of taking action. Our program focuses on securing guns appropriately, modeling behavior, helping parents have the discussion. When you send your child to a sleepover or camping, you ask the parents, do you have pets in the house that my child might be allergic to? Do you have food in the house? Are the parents going to be home for the teen party? You should also have the discussion, do you have a weapon? Not as a judgmental issue. Do you have a gun in the house, and is it secured? And then the other area is to recognize the signs of suicide, especially in our teens. And we also teach our teens to tell their peers about being smart around guns.
So there are these parental defenses that so often are lacking that would be so helpful in this. I want to turn to another large matter, and that is guns are an enormous center of profit and loss in many respects here. And I'd like to start with Mr. Carson, thinking that our sheriff's office, our law enforcement agencies encounter a huge expense in keeping gun violence under the control that we can keep it, and also caring for officers who have been traumatized by these violent situations. Would you speak to those matters of sort of profit and loss that we've got in law enforcement?
Well, let me first say that, Ms. Francis, that is, moms are the most important thing we have in the world, because they're willing to reach out and try to initiate change where other male egos may not be so willing to do that. And I want to applaud her effort, because clearly securing and making sure that adults in a home are responsible for the firearms, where they're placed, that sort of thing is critical to the safety of our children. I want to relate just really one quick incident before I answer that question. Burma is a company that makes a non-lethal firearm. It shoots a ball with a CO2 cartridge. And I had one in my office and I was using it. It was not loaded. And I had a youngster who was a very large youngster. He was about 6'2", came into my office. He saw that gun, walked over, picked it up and pulled the trigger. Just that quick. If that had been a loaded firearm, it would have discharged in my office. And so children, Ms. Francis is right. Children are eminently curious. They're gonna pick something up. They see it on TV all the time and they're gonna play with it, not understanding the danger that's inherent with it. Now, I apologize for deviating from your specific question, but the use of firearms in law enforcement goes back historically. I mean, the big time of guns and law enforcement was during Prohibition. Of course, we all know about that with the Tommy machine guns and all of that sort of. This is part of the history of America. And it's true. Police officers spend a great deal of time training to use firearms. We now have technology that helps officers determine when to shoot, when not to shoot. It displays on a screen and you shoot a simulated firearm into the screen, and then you can be critiqued on whether or not you used it in the proper time and that sort of thing. And I constantly hear from individuals who are entirely not in favor of law enforcement using guns, who say, well, why don't we shoot them in the leg or the hand? And what that is Hollywood. There is no human being, rare exception, maybe Annie Oakley, who could do something like that. But in the moment of stress, when you're making a life and death decision, you're not going to take a moment to shoot a gun out of a hand. That just does not work that way. And I've had some extensive training with it. Some of the young people are really excellent shots, but they're all taught to shoot at center mass. That's the most likely spot to kill somebody. So police officers are in a darned if you do, darned if you don't. If you're gonna shoot somebody and you shoot them in center mass, you're likely to kill them. And that's the whole point. And I mentioned earlier that we've moved from a strategy of hands-on and grappling with people and that sort of thing to just using technology with a taser and then a handgun. So that has really changed law enforcement from the 90s to the 2020s. But your second question is, what's the downside? And I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking me about that insofar as law enforcement is concerned. Now, other than officers who are involved in shootings suffer post-traumatic stress disorder or can, and so that's costly to the actual law enforcement agency, in addition to which there's the potential litigation that follows when somebody is shot and there's some question as to whether or not the shooting is what we would call righteous. And just let me say this about that. The bigger problem is that when you kill somebody, you've not just killed them, you've injured everyone in the extended family. So everybody who knew those people, who liked that fellow who was shot and killed, or that woman who was shot and killed, are angry at law enforcement. And that's a really huge problem, because that anger translates into a lack of dialogue with law enforcement, a lack of communication between civilians who know exactly what's going on in their community, talking to law enforcement. They won't do it. And that has severely hampered the law enforcement, particularly in Jacksonville, ability to get and gather intelligence about who the gangs are, where they meet, what they do, what they're engaged in. So the grandmothers are not talking to anybody. And historically, family members are who gave us the intelligence that allowed us to reach out and prevent the crime. And that's the most important function of law enforcement. It's not to write a report and have you tell me what happened. It's to prevent the crime from happening in the first place.
That is a tremendous loss that we see. It's certainly one that ranks right up there with monetarily. And Dr. Spitzer, would you maybe wind us up then by talking more globally about the profit of our firearms industries and the cost of the consequences of those industries?
Well, the firearms industry, despite what people may think, is not a particularly profitable enterprise, partly because gun companies produce a product that is highly durable. Now, you can buy a gun and put it in your dresser drawer and it'll sit there for 30 or 40 years or more, and it'll be perfectly operable. And even if you utilize a firearm regularly, they can be perfectly functional for decades with minimal care. So the firearms industry is always interested in ways to increase its profitability. And I will say that is one reason why it has so furiously marketed what are called assault weapons or assault rifles. And that marketing effort dates back to the 1980s when they first kind of caught on in the civilian market. And they marketed those weapons furiously precisely because of their military attributes and similarities to the weapons utilized by the military. And of course, they started to be used in mass shootings, and they realized that they had a political problem on their hands. But that's a good example of a kind of weapon that they love to sell because they have numerous accessories that you can buy, interchangeable parts, because the markup on them is greater than for other types of firearms. And obviously the gun industry is out to make it profit. It sells a legal product. And that's where it unites with what's called the gun lobby, with the NRA and similar gun rights groups, where they have a shared interest in pressing as many guns into as many hands as possible, whether for a profit motive or a political motive. And that is the thing that sort of brings them together.
I want to just add one thing. Smith & Wesson raised or ranked in $1.1 billion in sales over the last 12 months. It was the most lucrative year ever. We know during the pandemic, gun sales went up astronomically. We would like to see, I can lock my car from my bedroom. I can disarm it, my phone and my car if they get stolen. And rather than protecting the gun manufacturers from liability, we should be incentivizing them to create a smart gun so that they can't be fired by people who are unauthorized to it.
Well, they've produced those firearms for a number of years. They actually had those available when I was a police officer in Miami back in the 70s. And it was fairly simple to use, but I think that the cost effectiveness in terms of profitability is waning. And you have a number of people who speak to the issue and say, well, that's gun control.
We have certainly had a spirited conversation, and I've learned an enormous amount of things that are disturbing, just disturbing. And now, viewers, it's your turn. What questions do you, our viewers, have for these distinguished guests? Please send them to us via your chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we shall enjoy answering what you are interested in. I return this to our president, Maria Mark.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much for leading such a thoughtful discussion with our panelists, Dr. Spitzer, Ms. Jean Francis, and Mr. Dale Carson. So we do have some questions. If everyone can unmute, Mr. Carson, if you could unmute your mic. Some of these will just be general to the panelists. Some may be specific to one panelist in general. But so is there anything that our police officers can do or should do to reduce shootings in our cities? And I'll open that to all the panelists.
Well, I have specific thoughts about that, but the other panelists may want to add something first.
But I don't think it's an issue of only the police. Mr. Carson spoke to it to some degree. It's really a responsibility of all of us. And as we look at the underlying cause, some of the contributing causes, we need to address things like poverty, lack of opportunity. But we also have to recognize that gun violence can knock on anybody's door at any time. We are all subject to it.
I would just add that gun trafficking is a significant problem when it comes to guns flowing into high crime areas. And there is no federal regulation, no federal law regarding interstate gun trafficking, data analysis, gathering, collection is haphazard. Localities are not required to submit data to the FBI regarding at least certain kinds of gun crimes and gun problems. A lot more could be done, especially in terms of trafficking, finding patterns, and identifying behaviors that can intercede before somebody pulls a trigger at of a gun and fires at another human being.
Well, let me just add to that, Doctor. I think you're exactly right that the trafficking is an issue, but in order to investigate that, police officers, particularly street officers, do a lot of traffic stops. For those of us who've gotten tickets, we know how frustrating that is, but the purpose of an actual citation issuance in the inner city area is to determine whether or not there's the smell of marijuana and whether or not there's an attitude behind the wheel. And those things are not frequently discussed, but the point is to make an arrest by the police officer. That constant level of harassment limits the ability of law enforcement to receive intelligence from the inner city community, because everybody, as I mentioned earlier, is frustrated at law enforcement. When a kid gets a $158 ticket for driving with a burnt out taillight, as an example, where is he going to pay for that? I mean, it's a huge problem, and law enforcement have been, and city governments don't want to do away with traffic citations. And the reason is because it's a revenue stream, a significant revenue stream for them. So here we are treating civilians as though they're criminals, and likely they become criminals over time. And it's a big problem. And we kill ourselves because we don't get the intelligence. Who's trafficking the guns? Where are they coming from? Who's distributing them? All of those sorts of things. And let me just say one last thing, Doc, just for you personally. The advent of a semi-automatic gun is a problem. Now, I'm an old wheel gun guy. So a wheel gun is just a revolver, and it doesn't have multiple rounds, in addition to which the trigger pull on it is only about, well, a revolver is probably 7 or 8 pounds. In a semi-automatic handgun, it can be as little as 3, and an infant can discharge the weapon. So that's another aspect to the problem that we are encountering as a community.
Absolutely right.
Thank you. And that's a good segue, Mr. Carson, into this next question. And that is, typically in these mass shootings that we hear about almost on a daily basis, these automatic weapons are usually the weapon of choice. So should they be available to the general public? I mean, if so, then why not RPGs and other missile type weapons?
I think that's a great question. I don't know that I have the answer. No matter what you answer, you're going to offend people on both sides of that equation. Clearly, you shouldn't have RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. You shouldn't have missiles. But in America, we're used to having handguns, certainly. Now, rifles for use in hunting, they don't, and California has done this, they limit the magazine size. So that seems like a reasonable approach, but it doesn't solve the problem. The problem gets back to whether or not children value human life. That's what it gets back to. And I think that when we don't value human life, or we're in constant conflict, and we see on TV all the time in the movies, people with these guns, and they want to emulate those actors with those wild guns, then we're creating our own problem. And it's like shooting yourself in the foot and saying you're a good shot, which is true. It's true. If you shot yourself in the foot, you'd be a good shot, but you've injured yourself. And so I really don't believe that people should have 30-round magazines, 100-round magazines. But I will tell you that, as was mentioned earlier by Ms. Francis, there's a tremendous profit in the accessorizing of those firearms.
So, and this is open to all the panelists. So what does gun control mean to you, either as an expert or an advocate?
I think, again, keeping guns out of the hands of people who should not have them.
And how do you do that? Because
Well,
mental health, I mean, you know,
mental health
is
is
a key
is a
factor
key issue.
connected.
yes.
Right.
When
Is that
when we
part of
look
your-
again,
I'm sorry,
Yes,
is that
when we
part of
look
your
at-
mission and your education? Yeah.
it is part of the mission in education. When we look at 2/3 of the handgun deaths are suicides, and add in the mass shooters who invariably have whether it's diagnosed or not, they do have mental health issues. Yes, having a robust mental health system is critical. You know, after Parkland, we enacted the law and added more counselors into the school system to identify children with problems. And that has happened. The problem is there's no one in the community to treat them.
Mhm.
So we need a strong mental health system as part of the initiative. And then again, the gun laws, which Dr. Spitzer spoke of, and some that I have spoken to, we're not looking at banning guns. We're looking at keeping the hands of people who should not have them.
There's no shortage of public policy, gun policy, ideas, proposals, laws that could address many of the fundamental problems. You'd never eliminate them. Obviously, there are a great many firearms in America, but only a very small percentage or proportion of firearms are actually involved in criminality, criminal activities. There are twice as many long guns in America as there are handguns, and long guns are easier to get, but 80% of all gun crimes are committed with handguns. Handguns are the guns of choice when it comes to the harm caused by firearms in America. And that's one reason why historically there's been more focus on regulating handguns, and that more effectively, arguably, in the 19th century than today. Contemporary policy ideas like red flag laws, licensing and registration laws, requirements for training. I mean, the fact that states have moved away from requiring training or even gathering simple information about people who want to have a handgun represents a step away from improving the situation. And that is, certainly not helpful in terms of the ability of public policy to address what is a legitimate and addressable public policy problem, that is the gun problem in America.
And do you all think that is because it's such a politicized issue that we don't have these background checks in place? We don't have, I mean, in order for you to drive a car, you have to have a driver's license. You have to testing.
Well, let me just say, there are background checks in place. They exist. They exist today. You can't buy a firearm unless you have a background check from a retailer. So the problem is that you can right now go into the inner city, and for $50, you can buy as many handguns as you like at $50 a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem that I think the doctor is referring to when we talk about trafficking, because they're so readily available. People store them in odd places. Their homes get burglarized. If you're in a car and you're in a federal building, you can't carry a gun, so your car gets burglarized and the gun's stolen.
Right.
So those guns, by the way, are registered. When you buy a gun from a retailer, it is registered to you. Now, if you trade it off or you sell it off, then that gets lost. But the FBI has been very successful in the past of tracking down the new ownership of those guns. So those laws do exist, and they do prevent people from acquiring handguns who should not acquire them. The problem is on the secondary market, anybody can get any kind of gun they want. All they have to do is have enough cash with them in order to acquire it.
So
22% of guns are purchased legally without a background check. There are many loopholes, or several loopholes in the background check law. One in 9 people who go to, say, the internet or these unlicensed dealers would not be eligible to purchase a gun if they had if they were screened by a background check. And as we know, there are even within the system, the reporting isn't well integrated, and so things get missed. Look at the Charleston shooting and the shooting at the church in Texas. Both of those individuals would not have qualified to purchase weapons.
But in order to stop the use of handguns in personal crimes, you've got to essentially eliminate all the handguns, because what happens is people know you have a gun. So they just break into your house, get that gun, use it. And I've seen that in a number of separate cases for which we have provided defense activities. So the acquisition of firearms is always a possibility. And that's one of the levels of premeditation. If you go to get a gun to then use it to kill somebody. So I don't know how because I agree with most of what you're saying, Ms. Francis. I do. I think we should limit access of guns to a number of individuals. But how that's accomplished is another matter entirely.
Well, if I could just,
evil people do evil things, and they are clearly not concerned about breaking the law because that's what they do every day.
well, that is certainly true, but the question is whether it can be easy or difficult for people to acquire guns that they shouldn't otherwise have. So, for example, if everybody kept the lock on their guns, the guns that they stored at home, then a prospective thief would have to confront the problem of a locked gun. And that would certainly ratchet up the degree of difficulty for that person. As it is, nearly half of all guns kept in homes today are not locked up. And we know, and you know, Mr. Carson, that one of the things that thieves prize in a break and enter, for example, is a firearm. If there's a firearm in a home and you're ransacking the place, you'd like to take that gun for a variety of reasons. So is it easy or is it hard? And that does matter in terms of the outcome.
Well, let me say something you may not be aware of, and probably in your work you are, that the theft of a firearm at a residential burglary is a life felony. It's a life felony. In other words, when you break into a house, when I was a cop in Miami, you might get a year if you stole a handgun. And that was in the 70s. Today, you break into a house in Jacksonville, Florida, you steal a gun, you get charged and convicted, you mandatory 30 years. So the laws are stiff, but I will just tell you that the inner cities individuals that I work with are willing to take that risk. They don't live in the same world that you and I do. And they live in an environment where what happens tomorrow is more important than anything is not important at all. It's what happens right now that's important to their existence.
Well, let me just kind of wrap up here. We're at 7:59 and I like to end on time just to respect everyone's time. But there was a question about how, and this is really directed to Ms. Francis, about how we can get involved locally in your gun violence prevention movement. And
Sure.
you could,
We do have actually 2 groups here in Jacksonville. One is the Jacksonville Beaches group, and then there's another one on what we call the other side of the river. We work together on many issues, but you can text join to 64433. You can email momsdemandjb@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook. We do have a closed Facebook group, but you can find us on Facebook, Moms Demand Action Jacksonville Beaches, and I'm just asked to be included. We do many activities, the Be Smart program, we try to take that out about in the community. We also do Advocacy Day in Tallahassee every year, so we're lobbying our local and state legislators on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Francis. So if they really just Google Moms Demand Action,
Here,
Your
I'm going to put
websites.
it in the chat box.
okay. And we can put that on our website as well for those who want to contact you or contact your organization directly.
Correct.
I want to thank Dr. Spitzer, Ms. Francis, and Mr. Carson for joining us. Again, Sharon Scholl for putting together this most informative program tonight. We have learned a lot. It is a very frustrating issue, if you will, for a lot of people, and it has impacted, like as Mr. Carson said, it doesn't just impact the victim or the shooter. It impacts our whole community. So thank you all for joining us. Please remain on our video for just to take our short meeting survey at the end of this meeting. And then again, you can see the recorded meeting tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, and you can also get the link on our website, beacheswatch.com. Don't forget about our September meeting. That will be with our Mayport commanding officer, giving us an update of what's going on our naval station here at the beach. So thank you again. We really appreciate your time, and we will be here next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Francis.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Doc.
Thank you,
Nice
Dale.
to meet you.
Dr.
Yes,
Spitzer.
indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.